They told you a single number decides your retirement. Hold that thought, because it is the most expensive lie in modern finance, and half the country has quietly built their whole future on it. Here is the honest answer before I prove it, so you are not waiting on me. Yes, the number in that title matters in the way weather matters. It moves markets for a day. It moves your account balance for a day. But your retirement does not actually ride on it, and anyone who tells you it does is selling you the panic, not the truth. What your retirement really rides on is a much quieter question, one nobody in the financial press will put to you plainly. Is the wealth you spent 40 years building sitting inside a promise that can break, or is it sitting in something that cannot break at all? That is the whole ballgame. Everything else is noise dressed up as urgency. I have spent a long time in the gold and silver world, sitting across the table from people who did everything right, and I have watched that one distinction decide who slept at night and who did not. So let me show you what that number is really testing and why the answer has nothing to do with the day it prints. Start with a plain fact most Americans have never had to learn because we have been lucky. A dollar in a bank is not money you own. It is a loan you made to the bank. You handed them your savings, and in return, you hold a promise to pay it back. That is what a deposit is. That is what a bond is. That is what most of the paper inside a typical retirement account is. It is somebody else's promise. And a promise is only ever as good as the person on the other end of it, and their willingness and their ability to keep it. Now, watch what happens when that promise gets tested somewhere. The luck ran out. Look at what savers lived through in Turkey this past stretch of years. Ordinary people, people exactly like you, who worked, who saved, who put their money in the bank the way they were told was responsible. And they watched the value of what they had saved get eaten alive. Not stolen in a single dramatic night, melted, slowly, as the currency their savings were denominated in lost its footing. A lifetime of careful saving could buy a fraction of what it bought a few years earlier. They did nothing wrong. The promise their money sat inside simply weakened underneath them while they slept. And that is not even the harder story. Go to Lebanon in that same window of years. There, savers did not just watch their money lose value, they watched it get trapped. People with real balances in the bank, their own money, went to withdraw it and could not. The doors were effectively closed to their own savings. Limits, freezes, lines, a slow motion lockout. Some of them had put a lifetime of work into those accounts. And the cruelty of it was that on paper, the number was still there. The statement still showed the balance. The promise still existed as ink. It just could not be honored. The number was real. The money was gone. Sit with that for a second, because this is the part the financial channels will never connect for you. In both of those places, the people who got hurt were not gamblers. They were the responsible ones. They were the savers. They had trusted the promise, because trusting the promise is exactly what a lifetime of sensible advice tells you to do. And here is where it gets uncomfortably close to home. The mechanism that failed them is not some exotic foreign disease. It is the same mechanism your own savings sit inside. A deposit is a loan to a bank. A bond is a loan to a government. It works beautifully right up until the day it does not, and nobody rings a warning across the sky before that day. Now bring it home, because you are not a saver in Beirut. You are a retiree right here in the United States. Picture a retired shop teacher in Indiana, 30 plus years in the same district, packed his lunch, never missed a mortgage payment, built a solid six-figure balance in his 401k, the slow, honest way. He is not reckless. He watches the financial news precisely because he is careful. And every time one of these big data days comes around, the anchors put a countdown clock on the screen and tell him his future hinges on the next print. So his stomach tightens. He refreshes his account. He wonders if he should have done something differently. And that anxiety, that churning, is not a side effect of the coverage. It is the product. Fear is what they sell, because a frightened viewer stays glued, and a frightened saver makes moves that somebody else profits from. Here is what I want that man in Indiana to understand, and what I want you to understand. The number does not own you. What owns you is where your wealth is parked. If every dollar of it sits in promises, then yes, you are exposed to every crack in every promise, and the news is right to make you nervous, though wrong about why. But if a portion of it sits in something that is nobody's liability, something that does not depend on a bank staying solvent, or a currency holding its value, or a central banker keeping his nerve, then the number becomes what it always should have been: interesting, not fatal. That is the difference between a promise and a possession. Gold is not a promise. Silver is not a promise. They are not somebody's obligation to pay you back. They do not have a counterparty who can freeze the doors or inflate the value away. For 5,000 years, across every empire that rose and every currency that died, an ounce of gold stayed an ounce of gold. It cannot be printed into oblivion because no government controls how much of it exists. It cannot be trapped behind a bank's closed doors if you hold it inside a structure you actually own. And that single property, being nobody's liability, is the entire reason it has survived every promise that ever broke. Let me put the honest caution on the table right now, because I will not insult you by pretending this is a magic answer. Gold and silver do not pay you interest. They sit there. In a calm decade where every promise gets honored, that paper you own may well outperform the metal, and I am not going to stand here and tell you otherwise. Metal can have long stretches where it goes nowhere or drops hard. I have watched silver get cut down violently in a matter of days when the exchanges raised the cost of holding it, even though not one thing about the real world had changed. This is not a guarantee, and it is not a promise of a price. What it is insurance against exactly the kind of failure those savers overseas lived through. You do not buy insurance because you are certain the house burns. You buy it because you cannot afford to be wrong if it does. That is the honest case, downside and all. And this is the natural place to tell you how ordinary Americans are acting on that idea, because a lot of people watching this have most of their life savings inside a retirement account and assume they are stuck with only paper. You are not. My family put together something called the Retirement Wealth Protection Guide. It is free, and it walks through how folks with $100,000 or more in a retirement account can move a portion of it into physical gold and silver, real metal, inside the account they already have, without taxes and without penalties. Here is the fact that pushed a lot of people to finally look into it. The central banks of the world, the most powerful financial institutions on the planet, spent 3 years running buying gold at a record pace, more than they had in a generation. They were the customer. Ask yourself why the institutions that issue the promises are the ones quietly stacking the one asset that is nobody's promise. This is not just for insiders. If you have $100,000 or more in any retirement account, this is for you. If you are watching on your TV, scan the QR code on your screen. If you are on your phone or your computer, go to readfamilyguide.com. From our family to yours, no obligation, nothing to buy. Now let me answer the question you are probably still holding. If the number does not decide my future, why does the whole world act like it does? And the answer is the enemy in this story, so pay attention. The big banks, the trading desks, and the financial media do not make their living off your calm. They make it off your motion. Every time you flinch on a day-to-day and rearrange your account, somebody on the other side of that trade earns a spread. Every minute you spend terrified of the next print is a minute you spend watching their programming and absorbing their framing. Calm retirees are terrible customers, so they will never ever tell you the quiet truth, which is that the safest thing you can usually do on one of these loud days is nothing at all. Here is where it gets genuinely strange, and this is the part almost nobody connects. The same institutions that put the countdown clock on your screen are the ones telling you, with a straight face, to ignore gold. They call it a relic. They call it a pet rock. They say it pays no yield and does nothing. And then those very same institutions, the central banks that stand behind the whole promise-based system, go out and buy that so-called relic hand over fist. There is a name for a system where the people running it quietly do the opposite of what they advise you to do. It is not conspiracy. It is just incentive. They need you inside the promises. Their own reserves, they would rather hold in the possession. And watch what happened to push them there. Not long ago, one of the largest nations on Earth had a huge chunk of its foreign reserves frozen, essentially overnight, by decree, because of a geopolitical falling out. Reserves it thought were money, sitting safely in the promises of other nations, turned out to be freezable with the stroke of a pen. Every central banker on the planet watched that and learned the same lesson those Lebanese savers learned the hard way. A promise can be revoked, and metal in your own vault cannot. That is precisely when the record buying accelerated. The most sophisticated money in the world quietly moved to reduce its dependence on anybody else's word. They did not send out a press release telling you to do the same. Let me stack one more pillar on this, because the history rhymes and the pattern is older than any of us. Go back to when the United States tore up its own promise. For decades, the dollar was tied to gold at a fixed rate, a sacred anchor. Then, in the early 1970s, a president stepped up and said the tie was suspended. Temporary, he called it. It was never restored. In one announcement, the promise that had underwritten the entire global money system was quietly rewritten, and every dollar in every account became a pure promise, backed by nothing but confidence. And in the decade that followed, an ounce of gold went from around $35 to over $800. Not because gold changed, because the promise did, and people rushed back toward the thing that was nobody's promise. That is not ancient trivia. That is the exact playbook, and it has run more than once. And that record buying was not a blip that came and went. It piled up until something quietly historic happened inside the world's reserves. Gold climbed past the point where it became the second largest reserve asset held by central banks, behind only the dollar, edging out the bonds of other governments in the process. Think about what that actually means. The stewards of the promise-based system, given a free choice about where to keep their own rainy day wealth, moved it toward the possession and away from each other's paper. That is not a fringe newsletter talking. That is the collective judgment of the institutions that print the money. They will keep telling you gold is a relic, while they hold more of it than they have in a lifetime, because they need you calm inside the promises and themselves protected outside them. It has since cooled off some. Buying always ebbs and flows, but the direction of travel is unmistakable once you stop letting the countdown clock hold your gaze. Let me widen this to silver for a moment, because silver carries the same protection with an extra engine underneath it. Silver is nobody's promise either, the same as gold, but most of the silver pulled out of the ground each year is not mined for its own sake at all. It comes up as a byproduct of digging for copper and zinc and lead, which means the supply does not simply ramp up because the price rises. At the same time, the modern world burns through silver in ways it never used to, in electronics and solar panels and 100 devices, dispersed in tiny amounts too small to ever recover. There is an old line in this business that gold gets hoarded and silver gets used up, and it captures why the metal has run tight for years on end. For a saver, that means the same insurance against a broken promise, plus a supply story that does not bend easily to demand. It also swings harder, up and down, so it is not for the faint of stomach, and I would never tell you to load your whole future into it. But as a piece of the possession side of your ledger, it belongs in the conversation. Here is the honest limit, so you keep trusting me. I cannot tell you the day any of this matters most. Nobody can. There will be long, boring stretches where the promises get honored and the paper does just fine, and the metal sits quiet, and anyone who tells you they know the timing is guessing or lying. The pattern is not a stopwatch, but the direction of the pattern, the slow erosion of confidence in promises, and the slow accumulation of the one asset that is nobody's, that direction is not subtle once you know where to look. And almost nobody is looking because they are staring at the countdown clock. Think about what that number on a day-to-day actually is. It is a reading on the health of the promises. A hot inflation print says the currency your promises are denominated in is losing ground. A divided central bank, split over whether to raise rates or hold, is a room full of the smartest people in the system openly admitting they are not sure they can keep the promise stable. That is what the anchors are really showing you when they put the clock up. Not a threat to gold, a confession about paper. The savers in Turkey did not need a data print to tell them their promises were weakening. They felt it at the grocery store. By the time the number was undeniable, the protection was expensive, and the easy decisions were long gone. And that is the recognition I want to leave you with, in plain words. The people who move early on this are not smarter than you, and they do not have a secret phone line. They simply understood the difference between a promise and a possession before the crowd did, and they positioned quietly while everyone else was still watching the clock. By the time this idea is on every front page, by the time your neighbor is asking about it and every advisor is recommending it, the cheap, calm, unhurried part of the decision will already be behind us. Right now, when nothing feels like an emergency, is exactly the window when moving a portion of your wealth out of pure promises and into something that cannot break is still an easy, reversible, unpanicked choice. The urgency is not in the number. The urgency is in how quiet it still feels. So before I let you go, let me tell you how to think about your own position, honestly and without a prescription. You do not need to abandon the promises. Interest and yield have their place, and a paper account is not a sin. What you want is balance, so that no single broken promise can take down the whole thing you spent a lifetime building. Own a portion in the possession, not the promise. Hold the real metal, not a paper claim on metal that lives inside the same fragile system. And size it so that a loud, ugly stretch never forces you to sell at the worst possible moment. That is not a trade. That is how you make sure that no day-to-day, no frozen account, no weakening currency can ever again decide whether you sleep. That brings me back to the shop teacher in Indiana, and to you. The lesson from those savers a world away is not that America is Lebanon or Turkey. It is that the mechanism which failed them is the same mechanism we all trust without thinking. And the only families who came through it whole were the ones holding something that was nobody's promise to break. This is also about legacy, about the wealth your children and your grandchildren inherit, because a possession passes down clean and a broken promise passes down nothing. Our free retirement wealth protection guide walks you through how to protect and diversify a portion of what you have built and what you will leave behind, moving it into physical gold and silver inside your existing retirement account without taxes or penalties. And for those of you with 100,000 or more who watch all the way to the end here, we open up a free, no-pressure, one-on-one educational web conference. Just mention that you saw the full video. There is no fake deadline on this. The only reason to look now is the real one. This decision is cheapest and calmest precisely when it does not feel urgent, and that is today. If you were on your TV, scan the QR code on your screen. If you were on your phone or your computer, go to readfamilyguide.com. From our family to yours, your retirement was never riding on that number, the one in the title that brought you here. It is riding on whether your wealth sits in a promise that can break or in something that never has. Choose the possession, keep your balance, and let the clock tick for somebody else.